So let's talk about segmentation within supply chains. The most common way that segmentation is done for products is using something called an ABC analysis, and it does not stand for activity-based costing. That's a whole nother technique. But ABC simply are the categories that you create. You create an A category, a B category, and a C category. It's called ABC analysis. So when you segment, you want to find the Class A items. These are the important few, and these are the very few high-impact items. These are the ones you want to spend most of your attention on because they matter the most. And you expect exceptions to be made on these products. So you might not have a standard process. You want to treat these differently. These are high touch. Then you've got the B items. These are the ones in the middle. And we'll spend a lot of time on B items when we talk about inventory. These have moderate impact. And the reason why we spend time on them is because we'll talk about different ways we can automate the control, because we'll set up different policies that you can use. Now, the rules can also be used for A. So you develop these policies for B, and then you tweak them a little bit for A, for example. But the important thing is that A items are treated a little different. They're the critical ones. You want to automate for those B items. And the C items, the trivial many, there's a bunch of things you want to do. You might want to reduce the amount of time that you spend on them. You might want to actually try to remove some of those C items, that long tail. But you want to make sure that you don't spend too much time on them, and you make the control systems and everything as simple as possible. And so there's a lot of grouping and categorizing. And we'll talk more about this when we get into inventory. So the important thing, we talk about ABC, and it's widespread. When you go and talk to someone about an ABC analysis, everyone knows what you're talking about. But there's two things I want to bring up. One is the categories are arbitrary. What you call an A item could be partially a B or a B plus. So there's a lot of arbitrariness to this. So we're coming up with general rules. The second thing is items don't stop at the C level. You might have Class D, E, F, double F, triple F. When you think about the spare parts industry, they might have items that move. One spare part sells every 5th year or even longer, because they might have tractors in the field that have been in the field for 50 years. And so we usually talk about A, B, C, but some industries have much longer tails, and they manage those very differently, especially, like I said, the spare parts industry. So how do we do this? It's a very simple process. I have all my parts, and this is a simple example with a number of SKUs, and here are the part IDs in the first column. The second column, I have the individual price, or C sub I. That's the cost to me of each of the items, and you can see it ranges from about $25 a part down to about a quarter. The annual demand, that's D sub I, the annual demand for each product, and you can see how that varies. And what I created for this fourth column, I just multiplied the price times the annual demand, because that gives me annual value. Typically for ABC analysis, the thing that drives it is the value, the annual value that product brings, whether it's the total cost or the total revenue. In any case, it's two functions. One is the cost of each item and the demand. So the product, C times D, drives how I'm going to value these. Think back to the baseball and the hockey puck, right? What we were focused on there, the C's were relatively the same, couple bucks each for a puck versus a baseball. But the D's changed. That's the demand. And so you can think of, instead of annual demand, maybe monthly demand, and you might change that. But in any case, at the end of the day, I've got this annual value for each of my items. So what I've done is I've found it for each item, and now I'm going to sort this, and I'm going to categorize it. So this is, you see, 20 SKUs, a little over 4,000 units, in total of $22,000 in price. So I just blow this out, right? And I've sorted on this column the annual value. So now I have part 55K2 is the highest annual value. And I do a new column that says cumulative, so it just sums up to the cumulative value of all the products. And then I just take a percent of it. So 8,347 divided by total value, 21,984, means 38%. And then here, 13,544 divided by 21,984 gives me 62%. So I found percent annual value. So what do I do with this? Well, I'm ready to categorize. So I pick the top 20% of the SKUs, roughly 80% of the value. I'm going to pick the next that give me about 15% of the value, and then the C items that give me the rest. So you see why it's a little bit arbitrary, but what's common, firms really look for this 80-20. Sometimes they call it the 80-20 rule. It isn't always there, but for this case, it's just an example. So I break it up, and so then if I put it in, again, the same chart that I used for that grocery store example, the percent of the SKUs and the percent of the annual value, I have the same thing. I have the critical few, the important few, the A items here. I've got the C items for all the ones over here, and I'm going to treat them differently. And then the B items in the middle, right? So this is a good way to start for segmentation. Every company does some form of this, but they don't always stop there. For example, I might want to look at the variability of demand, and that's what I've got here on the vertical axis here. Demand variability. Why would that matter? Because I'm going to do my A, B, and C analysis, right? Just like we did on the previous slide. But variability of demand might matter. For example, let's say I sell 250 items in the course of a year. It would probably matter if I sold all 250 in one day, or versus I sold one item every day over the 250 work days. So having steady state, one every day, versus all the demand on one day, that's very different. So they'd have very different demand variability, and maybe I want to treat those high variability items differently than my steady state low variability. And so here's this one approach that different companies use is first they do the segmentation by ABC, but then they also look at the variability, and they create a cutoff, and usually it's coefficient of variation, which is the standard deviation of the demand over the mean or the average. And you have some cutoff there, and you identify whether it's a high variability or a low variability item. And then you can think of three big categories how we would manage them. For these ones in the top right, these are the volatile. I'm going to use very sophisticated techniques, frequent reviews. I'm going to spend a lot of time on them. Now the ones down here in the lower right, the stable products, I can automate some of those practices, less frequent reviews, and maybe use some manage by exception. So these would be the critical high value ones that I really spend a lot of time on. These ones a little less. And then these ones, the C items, whether they're low or high variability, I'm going to be, as simple as possible, very infrequent. But what we've done here is introduced other ways of categorizing. Because as I said, segmentation is more of an art than a science. There's not pure rules for it. It's kind of arbitrary at some point. But the key point is to break the products into segments that you can treat differently. You're going to take a different action. I'm going to manage these red products differently than from these tan products, differently from these green products. If I treated them all the same, then why bother segmenting? So you always segment for a purpose.